We were to play a little game of word association this evening. Wonder what words would pop into your mind whenever I say the word Christmas. Presents, turkey, tinsel, lights, tree. I want to suggest one more though. Conflict. Because actually for an awful lot of families, conflict is what dominates the big day. You think, for example, there's the conflict between different traditions, isn't there? You've got the husband. This is not our family, by the way, but you've got the husband, and he grew up playing board games with his whole family. His wife, though, she reckons that's way too much effort after a big dinner. She'd rather do what her family did, which is all zonk out on the sofa with a movie. There's conflict. There's conflict quite often between different generations, aren't there? So you've got great Aunt Hildred, who comes along every Christmas, and she merrily airs her politically incorrect opinions. And then you've got the younger generation, and they're far more enlightened than she is. And they're not going to let this stuff that great Aunt Hildred says lie. And so there's conflict, isn't there? There's the internal conflict that an awful lot of people go through. Should I be maybe a wee bit more restrained with my spending this year? I think my January self might thank me if I do that. Or should I decide I'll let my hair down? It's been a difficult year. That's what credit cards are for. There's conflict. It's sometimes said that there is a surge in divorces just after Christmas. And I don't think that's just because the solicitors' offices are closed for a couple of weeks. It seems to be genuine truth. There's evidence as well. The number of heart attacks goes up over the Christmas period as well. Christmas is a time of conflict. And tonight I want us to see that it has always been that way. Going back to the very first Christmas, there's always been conflict. We're looking at Matthew chapter 2, and the passage we read is a story of conflict. It's the conflict between two kingdoms and two kings. It's the conflict between King Herod and another king who threatens Herod's place on the throne. And this conflict is going to have tragic, heartbreaking consequences for innocent families who get caught up in the middle. We're going to see those consequences a little bit later, but I also want us to see this evening what happens in Jerusalem and in Bethlehem in this passage is also one battle in a wider war. Because there isn't just a conflict between Herod and this other king, there is a conflict between the kingdom of darkness and the kingdom of light. There's a conflict between Satan's kingdom and Christ's kingdom. And the murder of these innocent children is part of the war between the two. The war doesn't stop there. We see the war in Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. We see the war in Jesus casting out of demons. We see this war in Jesus' death on the cross. We see this war in Jesus' resurrection from the tomb. And even though we all know from the Bible that this war has got a clear winner, there's fierce fighting. And Satan, the loser of this war, he's still putting up resistance today. And so the conflict that we get a glimpse of in Matthew chapter 2, it's not simply the conflict of this chapter, and it's not simply the conflict of the entire Bible and the entire scope of history. It is the conflict that is being played out today. It's being played out in our society, and it's being played out in our own hearts. And so as we look at this conflict tonight, we're going to be encouraged. Because as we think of the battles that we are a part of, we're going to see that the light triumphs over the darkness. What we're going to do tonight is we are going to look at the conflict from the perspective of Herod and his kingdom. And we're going to be thinking about three words. There's dominion, disturbance, and defeat. So dominion, disturbance and defeat. But first of all, dominion. Dominion. So verse 1, Jesus is born in Bethlehem in Judea. When's he born though? During the time of King Herod. So in other words, Matthew's telling us Jesus didn't simply come into the world in a vacuum. There's stuff going on. There is already a king in Judea. What is King Herod like? Well, we have the gospel writers, Matthew really, mainly, and we have what he tells us about Herod, but there's also a fair amount of other historical accounts of Herod's reign, and especially if you're interested, the historian Josephus, he has quite a lot to say about Herod, and I know that not everybody is madly interested in history, but I think the history that we read outside of the Bible about Herod is particularly interesting, because whenever you learn what other writers had to say about Herod, and then you come back and you read what Matthew has to say, you think to yourself, actually, this makes an awful lot of sense. So what do we learn about Herod? Well, by the time that Jesus was born, Herod had been on the throne of Judea for about 30 years or thereabouts. But it hadn't been plain sailing. Herod was not part of the royal family. He didn't just become king like Charles did a few years ago because he happens to be next in line. He had to work for it. He had to fight, he had to maneuver, he had to plot, he had to scheme. And really, Herod being king all came down to geopolitics. And what I mean by that is there were two big superpowers who were particularly interested in the land of Judea. They both wanted to be able to control it. There was Parthia on the one hand, and then there was Rome on the other. And they both wanted to install their own puppet king in the land of Judea. They wanted a man who would do what they wanted, not what somebody else would want. And so the Parthians, they were backing the current king. But Herod, he managed to wheedle his way into being the Romans' choice of king. Herod didn't really have a rightful claim to the throne, but he got the Romans on board. He convinced them that he would be their guy. There was a war. Herod and the Romans, they put Jerusalem under siege, and eventually Herod was set up as the king of Judea. Although even though he was king, the Romans were the ones who really called the shots. And so you think about that. Herod has put Jerusalem under siege. Herod is not the rightful ruler. Herod has got the Romans on his side. It makes sense then that he was despised by the people, doesn't it? And it makes sense that Herod always had to be a step ahead if he was going to cling on to power. Herod had to face all sorts of plots and all sorts of conspiracies and actually all sorts of assassination attempts over the course of his reign. And whenever he found out about a plot, or whenever he just thought that there might be a plot, he had to take action. And he would be particularly savage whenever he caught wind of a conspiracy. He killed his own wife. He killed 3 of his own sons. And he killed a whole host of other family members because he thought he couldn't trust them. And it worked. Because here he is at this point, 30 years on, and he's still king of Judea. He is savvy enough and he is savage enough to establish his grip on the throne. He's a tyrant. He's a despicable human being. But his kingdom is secure. And that's the world that Jesus is born into. He's born in Bethlehem, in Judea, during the time of Herod. The reason I tell you that is not just because this is interesting, and it's not just because it backs up what we see in Matthew's Gospel. The real reason I'm telling you that is that in Herod's dominion, don't we see echoes of another dominion? There's the kingdom of darkness. The kingdom of darkness has got a king. He's called in the Bible the God of this world, and he's called the prince of the power of the air. And he's a cruel king. He's even more cruel and even more cunning than Herod. He blinds people. He tricks and deceives people. He uses violence to get his own way. And there is no trick that is so despicable that the king of the kingdom of darkness isn't willing to use it. You think of the various ways that he ensnares people to keep them down. Some people he gets completely tangled up with really immoral sin, horrible sensuality, really obviously wicked sin, and he gets them totally ensnared in them. And other people, he gets them every bit as entangled in good, clean living. And the pride that goes along with that. You think of the ways that the king of the kingdom of darkness is able to stop his subjects from coming to hear the truth about Jesus. And for some people, he lays the trap where they just completely deny anything that cannot be seen or measured or touched. But for other people, he lays the trap of false gods. And they're very religious. All their religious efforts are going in the wrong direction. And then for some other people, he has got the most devious trap of all. The trap he lays has got a Christian bait, doesn't it? And he ensnares his subjects with what is called Christianity, but really it's superficial and it's external and it doesn't lead to faith in Jesus. And it works. And he's able to keep his subjects trodden down. Satan, like Herod, is crafty and he's wily. And on the day that Jesus is born, Matthew 2 verse 1, Herod's kingdom is firmly established, but Satan's kingdom is firmly established as well. And on the throne, there's a tyrant, and he is ready to smash the slightest hint of rebellion against his rule. So the question is, how is the birth of Jesus going to change all of this? Well, the second word we're thinking of this evening, disturbance. Disturbance. You hardly need me to tell you the story. We know it so well this time of year. We've got these guys called Magi. They come from some land away off to the east. They're really, really excited because they have been watching the skies. They have seen something very, very unusual. They've seen this star. Now, we've got loads of questions about the Magi, don't we? And we'd love to know the answers. And what I would love to know is, what other things were they looking at? You know, what books, what records did they have that led them to believe that this star is something to do with the King of the Jews? We don't know. But we do know that somehow they made the connection in verse 2. And so they want to come and they want to find this King of the Jews. And so, well, the question is, where do you go to find them? Well, naturally enough, you go to the current king, don't you? They want to find out more. Whenever they get there, Herod, of course, does not share their excitement. I think we can understand that, can't we? Especially whenever we think of the history that's recorded outside